All right, so we're gonna get started. Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for the African Writers and Conversation series. We are delighted that you all could join us today. My name is Marius Kother, and I am a PhD candidate here at Yale University, but I'm joining you live from Accra, Ghana, where I'm currently based for my dissertation research. And today, I'm delighted to introduce you to Jennifer Makumbi. Jennifer Makumbi is a Ugandan novelist and a short story writer living in Manchester, England. Her debut novel, Kintu, won the Kwani Manuscript Project Award in 2013 and was subsequently published by Transit Books and One World Publications. Makumbi has a PhD in African literature from Lancaster University and has taught creative writing at colleges and universities around the United Kingdom. Her first collection of short stories, Love Made in Manchester, was published by Transit Books in January 2019. Makumbi is also a recipient of Yale University's Wendell Campbell Literature Prize, and her third book, A Girl is a Body of Water, has been recognized and celebrated in venues such as the New York Times, the Washington Post, Oprah Magazine, amongst other publications. We are so delighted to have Jennifer here today to talk about some of the major themes of the incredible book, A Girl is a Body of Water. So first, Jennifer will read an excerpt from the book, and then I'll ask her a few questions, and we will open it up for questions from the audience. So Jennifer, thank you so much for joining us today, and take it away.
Thank you, Marius, for that wonderful introduction. Often I forget some of the things, and you mentioned them. I'm like, yeah, that's me. Thank you, Yale, for inviting me, for having me again. I have such a good relationship with the university, not just because of the Wyndham Prize, but also because I've been invited to the African Literature Association Festival a few times. So I'm quite at home with you. I'm going to read from A Girl is a Body of Water, and I'm going to look at a part where Chirabo, the protagonist, is visiting MSutas, the supposedly witch, who has told her that she will help her with her problems, because Chirabo visited her the first time to say that she would like to find her mother, but also that she flies out of her body and she needs the witch to help her to get rid of that. So the second time she visited, the witch told her that, you know what, she could solve all her problems, but she flies because she has the first woman, or the original state of women before they changed inside her. And of course, Chirabo as a child was like, I'm getting rid of it. Please, how do we get rid of it? But MSutas said that maybe let's give it a chance. Let's see what it looks like, and probably give me a chance to explain exactly what it is before you get rid of it. So she tells her to keep visiting her so that she could explain. But one of the things she had already told her was that in the beginning, women were different from what we are now. And apparently, women came from the sea, and men came from land. And because of that, women were not allowed to own earthly properties, that if they wanted to own wealth, they should go back to the sea and grab all the marine wealth as much as they wanted. So she returns, and this time, this is the conversation they had. So after eating, MSutas put away the food wraps while Chirabo washed the plates behind the kitchen. Then Chirabo sat down and waited. So where did we stop yesterday? MSutas asked. When women were prohibited from grabbing land and animals. Oh yes. That was because the ancients had told another story, that women were not of land. Women were not of land? How? The ancients saw the universe as divided into 4 realms. Bring me a pencil on top of the bookshelf. Suta pointed above Chirabo's head towards the bookshelf. And the blue exercise book, and I will show you. She opened the exercise book to a fresh page, placed it on the floor, and drew a compass. The first realm was heaven. She wrote heaven where north would be. Then underworld. She placed it on the south point. Then the sea. She placed it on the west point. And finally land. She placed it on the east point. Now that is the ancient compass. Chirabo stared at the compass. It made better sense than the one pinned on the wall of her classroom. She was tempted to say, "You're not really blind," MSutas, but swallowed it. So heaven was the world of the gods, yes? Yes. The underworld is where the dead begin a new life again, yes? Yes. If land belonged to man, what is left? The sea. Aha, the sea. The ancients claimed was woman's realm. What? Women belonged in water? And if they did, they could not share in land wealth, could they? If you want property, they told ancient women, go back to your sea and grab to your heart's content. Eee! Even when they saw baby girls born the same as boys, well, they claimed that the very first woman rose out of the sea, while the first man emerged from earth. But that's not true. Nambi was Gulu's daughter. She came from heaven. Well, Gulu was her father, but who was her mother? Well, she did not have a mother, only a father and brothers. See, that is MSutas. They had found a hole in their first story of Chintune Nambi, and now they filled it. Nambi got a mother, a woman who apparently rose from the sea. Her name was Namazi. In fact, Namazi was said to have brought all water bodies on land. I've never heard of that, because this story was buried. When Chirabo did not respond, MSutas carried on. Apparently, Namazi was so magnificent that when Gulu saw her, he was mesmerized. She gave him a lot of sons, including Welumbe, the bringer of death, and Kaikuzi, the borrower, but only one daughter, Nambi. Then one day, after years and years of being together, Namazi, without provocation, without explanation, got up and went back to the sea. She never came back. Gulu was so heartbroken, he never remarried. He brought up his children on his own. So if the first woman came from the sea and returned to it, women belong there. Oh, I like Namazi. I like that I came out of her. Focus, Chirabo. She's a story which aggravated our situation. They used her to link our original state to the sea. You do not realize that ancients had such irrational fear of the nature of women that they would try anything to keep them under control. So they supported this story by pointing to the sea. Apparently, both women and the sea were baffling, changeful. Today they're this, tomorrow they're that. How was the sea changeful? Look, water has no shape. It can be this, it can be that, depending on where it flows. The sea is inconstant. It cannot be tamed. It does not yield to human cultivation. It cannot be owned. You cannot draw borders on the ocean. So to the ancients, women belonged with the sea like in marriage. Chirabo gnashed her teeth because ancients, especially Ganda males, were just too dumb for life. And to them, land belonged with men. Land was tame. It did as it was told. They tilled it, dropped seeds into it, and a few months later, they harvested. They divided and owned it. Like in a marriage? Exactly. And that is how women were stopped from owning land. Stories have such power you cannot imagine. That one turned women into migrants on land. And since then, women have been ruthless, moved not just across places, but clans, tribes, nations, even races. Here in Buganda, they sold mainly girls and women into slavery to the Arabs. They were considered ruthless. Chirabo's chest rose and fell, rose and fell. She imagined women cast into the sea, swimming, drowning, fighting sharks, building houses under the sea, being swallowed by whales, then women being sold to Arabs, being brutalized in Buarabu, and her complaints paled. She burst out. But could they not see that women had no gills or fins? Now, do not make me say the obvious, Chirabo. Suta was getting impatient. Besides, the world is blind. Life is too rich for the eye to see everything we look at. You think you can see, but right now, you are blind. Chirabo looked at Nsuta's eyes. Yes, Chirabo. Nsuta answered the question in her mind. I only started to see what I had looked at all my life after I lost my sight. Chirabo closed her eyes as if it would stop Nsuta from listening to her thoughts. So when our ancients looked at women, Nsuta continued, they saw something else. So what did they see? Water in women and women in water. Think, Chirabo, how many of our stories link women to water? Chirabo hummed her memory into action. She had been paralyzed by the idea of women learning to live in water. An idea occurred to her and she snapped her finger. Like River Mayanja, a woman gave birth to it. Oh, are those twin rivers? What are they called? Says Zibwanda. Yes, a pregnant woman was traveling when birth pain started. She squatted on the roadside, but instead of a child, water came out. It split into two. One half flowed to the east, the other to the west, and two rivers were formed. Oh, Chirabo's memory had woken up. Most bodies of water, wells, spas, streams, belong to women's spirits. Goddess Naluvale owns Lake Victoria. Goddess Nancha owns that stream on grandfather's land. And Goddess Nambale owns our well. Because ancients claimed Namas brought all the water on land. Should have marveled. So your grandfather's family owns most of the land in Nateta. But does it claim stream Nancha or Nambale, the well where we collect water? No, because they can't contain it. Oh, I've just remembered a big one. Shirabo was on her knees. This is big, Nsota, huge. She held her hands above her head to show its hugeness. I swear ancients used this story to make women belong in water. Well, tell me, Mijini, don't you know Mijini, Nsuta? Nsuta shook her head. Mijini are female spirits that live in rivers, wells, lakes, or seas. In daytime, they stay in water. But at night, they creep out. And when they come out, they turn into real women to tempt men. There are a lot of them in Ginger. They creep out of the Nile. They are beautiful. I mean, killer beautiful. When men see them, they cannot help falling in love because they seem quiet, gentle, and restful. A man says, "Mama, your beauty is going to kill me right now if I cannot be with you. But once he takes her home, what happens? Well, tell me. She turns into a terrifying creature and tortures him. Really? MSuta's face shone. One time, a man took a Mjini home like that. She kept saying, my friend, maybe this is too rushed. Maybe we should get to know each other first. But did the man listen? No. That night, when the man got up to turn the light out, she said, I'll do it, and stretched her arm across the room and snuffed out the flame. Then, in the dark, she started to torture the man non-stop throughout the night. She had arms like an octopus. They were everywhere. And in the morning, the man woke up on a crag in the middle of Lake Victoria, bruised and broken. Thank you.
Wonderful, wonderful. So one of the things I think that passage shows that you do really well throughout the novel is putting stories upon stories upon stories. I just love the way you're able to narrate a variety of stories at once. And that also passage brings me to a question that I wanted to ask you about the age of Kirabo at this moment when she's having these interactions with MSuta. I think she talks over and over again about the fact that she's 12, but she's walking her 13th year. And I was wondering if you can talk a little bit about why her process of unlearning what she has learned as a young girl, for you, why was it important to locate that process of unlearning with MSuta at the age of 12? Why was that age so essential for the way that the story will unfold?
Okay. Yeah. First of all, culturally, when a girl hits 12 in Buganda, you start to get all kinds of education, traditional education. So that you have sex education. And, she hasn't started it because she's not with her aunt. But you later see, as soon as she goes to Aunt Abby's starts to, prepare her for marriage, for sex, for that kind of thing. So age 12 is a safe age for tradition to start preparing a girl for adulthood. So for MSuta, who between you and me is a traditional feminist, she also thinks, okay, this is my chance to get in there and prepare this girl, okay? But at the same time, Chirabo is about to leave the village. And MSuta has not had a chance to talk to this girl, okay? But she's also just realized that as soon as Chirabo told her that there are two people in me, and one of them flies out, and I do terrible things. And when I'm told, don't do that because you're a girl, I actually do it. MSuta realized that I have a rebel on my hand. And she realized that this is the time to prepare her for a life of rebellion as a girl. So that age is such a wonderful opportunity because traditionally that age is where, all the teaching starts. But at the same time, there's a lot going on in Chirabo's life, but also there's a movement that is about to happen. So she moves out of the village. And if she doesn't get this knowledge, she won't be prepared for life.
Great, thank you. And I'm gonna ask another question, but we do hope the audience, if you have questions, please put them in the chat and we'll be sure to try to address those as well. One of the things that also comes out of this, these very few interactions with MSuta is that you're doing something really important with thinking about storytelling as a form of epistemology and the ways that you're approaching the ways that stories fundamentally shape our understanding of our world, but also reflect what we value and the ways that we want the world to be understood. So I'm wondering, as a storyteller yourself, what do you hope your stories do in the world? And how do you create characters that kind of reflect that work that you're trying to do with your own stories?
Well, as MSuta, the feminist says, if the world is made up by stories, especially myth, all life is about myth making. That we create myth from individual levels to racial levels. As an individual, you create myths around you, the way you want the world to perceive you. As a family, you have your own myth. As a tribe, as a clan, you have myth. As a nation, you create myth. As a continent, you create myth. So, and there's nothing you can do about myth making. It's always going to be there. So it is important to take part in storytelling, okay? Because this is where we create ourselves. For a long time, women did not take part in storytelling the way men were. Of course, they used to tell stories, but they were coded. As you could see in the story, you have to decode them to understand women's stories. But for a long time, we didn't tell our stories the way men told their stories, And so for me, it's very, very important to start joining in and telling stories. But it's also important for me to show that I am not the first, okay, traditionally. I've started with the novel, but there was a tradition of storytelling before me. And it's important for me to bring those stories in my novel and show the continuity between the old stories and my stories, that we're just discarding a few things, but we are carrying on with the same form. So the storytelling works hand in hand with myth making.
Great. So we have a question related to the theme of feminism from, so one of the audience members, who is anonymous, asked, how do you define the word, and I apologize if I mispronounce it, Nwakan no Kano, that comes up a lot in the book. I believe it may not simply translate just as feminism. So how would you define that?
Okay, the word is Mwenkanonkano, and this is the word for feminism in my language, and it's about equality. And it's very hard to tell who came up with it. We suspect that men started it in a way that was, derogative. The way they said, so you think you can be equal to us, even though you're smaller, you're weaker, and you're less intelligent and less everything. So, but Mwenkanonkano, it's like that the weighing machine, which goes up and down, up and down. So this is why you have the repetition, Mwenkanonkano, So it's all about equality. And for me, it was very important to show that there's a difference between Western feminism and Mwenkanonkano, okay? Western feminism arrives in June that year, So later after that part, Chirabo will arrive to visit, and Suta is listening to Western feminism on the radio. Okay, but it was important for me to show that Western feminism is becoming familiar within Uganda, but Ugandans are becoming aware how inadequate it is. Okay, and because of that inadequacy, therefore they've got to go back and look for traditional or their indigenous feminism, because wherever women were oppressed, of course, there were feminist thought, there was feminist action. It just wasn't similar to what was happening in the West. So this is why, therefore, you have MSuta taking Chirabo back to the ABC of Mwenkanonkano or indigenous feminism and starting to show her this is where it started, this is how it happened, this is what they did, this is where we're going, this is what we are now, okay, in order to prepare her. So, and it wasn't so much that feminism coming from the West was wrong. It's just that women are not similarly oppressed. You know, women oppression is culturally specific. So what happened to women in the West does not necessarily mean happened in Africa. So in the West, women had to fight to vote. In Africa, women didn't do that. In the West, women paid their dowry. I've never got that around my head around that. But in Africa, men are still paying dowry for women. So it's those things that I felt that Western feminism was not addressing. And I thought I needed to bring up indigenous feminism so that we do something that, is relevant to us, but which is part of the larger movement that is global feminism.
That's great. So I think one of the things that I'm reminded as you were saying that is even with the concepts of feminism as indigenous and the ways that you work around temporality and thinking about time, even the way that the novel itself is structured, the way we learn about different people's past, there's something that you do very well with temporality that both really allows you to see the fullness of the different characters, but also I think as a historian, I had moments where I'm just like, I want to know when exactly a concept like, sorry, how did you pronounce it again?
Mwenkanonkano.
Yes,
don't worry about it.
So I wanted to know, like, when does that become a concept which men started to organize around? And so I'm wondering if you could talk more generally about the way that you worked with time and thinking about the development of different concepts. And even when you talk about the ancients, for example, I wanted to know how far back those ancients are. And so can you talk a little bit about time and how you worked with that in the novel?
Okay, time is always my biggest problem in all novels, because I keep drawing time and said this happened, this happened then, this happened then. But fortunately for me, the idea of when women started to get oppressed, that lies back in when life started, when man became aware of himself, when woman became aware of himself. So that is set in that once upon a time, okay? However, the ideas of Mwenkanonkano, as far as the book is concerned, MSutas started to learn about them from her grandmothers. Now, if MSuta was born around the 1920s, then her grandmothers would go back to probably 1850s, but these are women who were abducted, because in Buganda, men used to raid other tribes and take women from them. And often they married them. But some of them, if they were stubborn, they sold them to Arabs. And those abducted women were so aware of their horrible space or horrible lives that they prepared their grandchild, So they talked to her about how all of this started. So MSuta didn't come up with these ideas. They came from her grandmother. But it was important that as MSuta gets an education, she builds on those ideas. So you see a lot of magazines later in her room, in her living room. She read those, but also she was a nurse, but also because of her life, she builds on that idea and includes the ideas of mermaids. You know, she's got access to 80s art, you know, and she builds all of that into concepts and ideas of Mwenkanonkan, which she passes then on to her grandchild. And this is the 70s when she passes them on. But it comes from women who were born in the 1850s.
Yeah, very good. We have a question from the audience related to the question of time and temporality. And the question is from Bhakti, and they are wondering, what were the challenges of weaving in real historical events, such as the Idi Amin years, into a coming of age novel about a particular family?
I love history. Perhaps it's the same all over the world with storytelling. We tend to love history. So weaving in history wasn't difficult for me. I decided that Chira was 12 years old. That was important. But also I decided that this is going to start in June when the Women's Conference in Mexico City is going on. And so once that was decided, I had 1975, so that had to be during Amin's regime. So for me, as far as that novel is concerned, Amin was a non-issue. I wasn't interested in Amin. And this is why I kept seeing him through Chirabu's eyes, knowing very well that as a child, she's protected from that knowledge. It's until she goes to the city that she gets closer to Idi Amin. But even then, her father is not willing to talk about it, you know, and she's carted away to the to boarding school. And that's when probably stories start to arrive. But even then, she's protected from much of the knowledge. That was because I didn't want my book to focus on Idi Amin. Because whenever you have someone like Idi Amin in your book, the West focuses on Idi Amin. And you know what? I just wanted to talk about my culture. So that was not difficult at all. But it was always the story that determined the history. So when I calculated the MSutas' age and grandmother's age, I had to go back to the 1930s. And then I researched the 1930s, the fact that Churchill visited Uganda, okay? But even then, I would not have Churchill in my book. So when I talk about him, I use Ugandan English that was spoken in the 30s. You know, so you have to be very careful to understand what Chirabu's great grandfather is saying to know, you know, how Churchill said, oh, that Uganda is a part of Africa, you know, because I knew again, Europe would latch on that. Oh my God, Churchill in Uganda. Ooh, yeah. So much as I love history, it's particular history that I would allow to seep into the story. If that history would be destructive from the, or distracting from the story, I muted it.
Yeah, thank you for that. And so going along the same kind of theme of women and water, we have a question from Steph Newell, and she's asking if you are reclaiming Mami Wata and women from the sea mythologies for global feminisms. Is the idea of water connected to women's history somehow in the novel?
Yes, I did. I of course I researched Mami Water and Yemaya, and I so desperately wanted to develop those issues, but I realized that if I take on that path, it would lead me away from the story. But it was very important to introduce water in terms of women and in terms of oppression and the possession of properties in Africa. But at the same time, I was very keen on pointing out that these are stories that are sometimes they can be enabling, but sometimes they can be used against women. Okay, so women and water is very interesting, but then it can be turned against them and said, look, if you belong in water, then you can't own earthly properties. You can't own land, so you're rootless. So you can be sold. Do you know? So I was aware that women and water all around the world, there's that mythology. It manifests itself differently in different cultures, and it's very interesting. But I had to be very careful how I used it.
Yeah. I was also thinking a lot about being Togolese. Myopia is really powerful figure in voodoo cosmology. So as I was reading, I was thinking a lot about myopia as well. And I had a question about the way that, going back to the question of history and temporality. So when you say that you wanted to locate the question of when did women become oppressed within the ancients and not really specify like a particular historical moment, one of the challenges that I have with that is that when we do not have a very specific kind of formulation about when things began to change and located within that kind of history that is a little bit ambiguous, I wonder if it presents this idea that, you know, women have always been oppressed, and therefore women will always be oppressed. And is there a way we can think about the idea of the oppression as having happened in the, you know, the time of the ancients that also still allows for the possibility of a time in the future in which women are not oppressed? Because if women have always been oppressed, then I think the quick conclusion is that women will always be oppressed. And how do we get out of that?
Now, that is a different novel. No, that is a different story, you know, because for me here, I was more interested in if we're going to understand what is happening to women, we need to go back to finding when it started, how it started, in order to undo it. For me, it was if they were oppressed in the past, then we can undo it now. And we are actually undoing it, because the kind of life I've led is not the kind of life my grandmother led. And definitely not my grandmother went to school though, but I can imagine how grandmothers could not imagine doing things. So for me, the idea that women will always be oppressed doesn't even cross my mind, because we have started this journey and we are getting there. And I feel that we've moved a little bit. Actually, we've moved a lot from where we were. So I wasn't so worried about the idea that I don't have a specific time. And I was aware that not all women were oppressed the same way, you know. There are a lot of matriarchal societies around the world, but again, they have a very different way that they are oppressed within even those structures, you know. So it didn't cross my mind at all that possibly by framing it this way, I'm stating that women will always be oppressed. For me, it didn't cross my mind, because at the moment we've already moved a few steps away from where we were in the past.
Great, thank you. So we have a question from the audience. This is coming from Kajatani Heka, and he says, thank you for sharing your wonderful work with us. I recently viewed your analysis of the opening sentence of nervous conditions and Daga impact. How do you see your work in relation to hers and perhaps other powerful women writing in Africa?
Yes, thank you for that. So I read nervous conditions, I think around 1989. and I was just finishing high school. This is why it was, and I grew up in a community, in a society where I was a girl and a woman, you know, and we behave in a particular way at that time. So that's why I related to that novel the way I did. But if you read any of my novels, especially A Girl is a Body of Water, nothing was unsayable here. I mean, I've had my family ringing and saying, I can't believe you wrote that. I can't believe you said that in your book. But that goes down to Dangarembuga, because I thought, well, she said it, the worst that you can say. I mean, if that book got published and if that book got read around the world, and if it's claimed to be one of the best books, feminist books out of Africa, which I totally agree with, then I can do what she did. But it wasn't only her. There's another Zimbabwean author, Yvonne Vera. She also talked about how our languages don't allow us to speak in a particular way, because as a woman, when you speak, your tone is low. You try to bend or to kneel. So our languages don't allow us to say things like that. But when you go to a novel, because you're writing on your own and there's no immediate interruption, you can say whatever you want to say. By the time the world reacts, you've moved on to the next novel. So that's Yvonne Vera. And even The Joys of Motherhood, by Bucha Mecheta. There are certain texts out of Africa that were so liberating that I read, and because I used to teach literature before I started to write, I had been made bold by the time I started writing. And that's what women writers, I call them ancestors, did for me.
That's wonderful. So we have another question from the audience. This one is coming from Rainy Mboya, and they ask, they're saying it's rare to see father figures as tender as Tom in fiction, flawed as he is. What was it like to build a strong masculine foil for Kirabo's progress through the novel, especially in contrast to the militarized masculinities of the Idi Amin regime?
Yeah. I've always been bothered by feminism's idea that on one hand you have men and on the other hand you have women. And women on one hand are good and oppressed, and men on the other hand are bad and terrible, because we grow up with our fathers, with our brothers, with our grandfathers, and you see sides of them that are not like that. So for me, it was very important to present men as these complex beings. So Tom is fantastic with his daughter. Is gentle, is wonderful. So his grandfather. The grandfather is cheating on grandmother, Tom, just drops his daughter onto his wife and says, deal with it, and if you can't, get out of my house. And by the way, leave my children behind. I so wanted to show the world that the men I know in Uganda are not clear-cut, terrible, patriarchal, this, whatever. The same men who are going to fight, for their daughters not to be oppressed will go back and do the same thing to their wives, the mothers of their children. The same men who hate their fathers for doing horrible things to their mothers will do the same things to their wives, and I've seen it. I've seen it in my brothers, I've seen it in my dad, I've seen it everywhere. And I thought, for me, this is what masculinities are like. So this is where Tom comes from.
That's really great. And I think that was that kind of texture, adding that texture, especially to African men, was one of those moments where I was just like, this is the kind of novels that we need. And I think it's also that kind of complexity. You do it also in relation to the women, especially in the ways that when you look at figures that appear in the very beginning to be like victims, and you see later on that they're very complicated and they have participated in the oppression and marginalization of other women. And so can you talk about why it was so important for you to present these women as flawed, as deeply flawed, but also deeply powerful, and also just struggling to, navigate this world for themselves?
Because these are the women I grew up with, these are the women I love, and for a very long time, love blinds you. It's until you step at a distance and you look at things and you realize, okay, this is interesting. So one of the moments that I remember was one of my uncle's wives. Whenever we came to her house with my aunt, she treated my aunts like husbands, and they enjoyed it. They didn't stop her, But one time I was asked to travel with her to her brother's house, and I could not believe how her demeanor, her body language, her size became so big when she walked into her brother's house, and she was like, "Where is wife?" And I was like, "Oh, seriously? You've just walked out of, But for me, it was very important because culturally, we are allowed to do this. There are moments when a Muganda woman is a man. As long as you're in your brother's house, you're no longer a woman because there's a woman there, and therefore you are an honorary man. And often women then, because they're being men for a moment, they overdo it. They ask to be knelt before, to be waited upon, and whatever. And for me, then I realized that women given a chance, they would do the same to women as men are doing to them. And that made them more interesting than the women I used to find in books who were oppressed and they didn't do anything about it and they were just sitting there crying. Because the women in my life, they would say, okay, he's doing this. He has no idea I cook his food, because I can do stuff to him through food. So I always found those women who are oppressed and crying and not doing something about it unrealistic. And so in my book, women are very careful how they navigate their oppression.
Yeah, I thought that the kind of complexity you conveyed about women in different houses and how they behaved was really interesting, because in my culture, in Ewe culture, our aunts from our father's side, they're literally called our female fathers. That's the literal translation.
Oh, yes, that's the same.
Yeah, and so when they show up and they're around you, they expect that you treat them just like your fathers and all of the trappings that came. And they do that vis-a-vis your mother as well. They expect your mother to treat them like their husbands. And so it was interesting to see that these cultures that are so far away geographically, these concepts also carry particular resonances across space. And so I thought that was really fascinating.
But also there are moments when men were feminized. So, for example, if my brother comes to visit my house, he belongs in the same space as I do. So when Tom dies, you can see a grandmother's brothers. They come and they behave like women. They're just doing their work. They are silent, because they married into that space. It's interesting, some cultures are what they're like. And I didn't know this was different until I came to Britain and saw different things. So then that became interesting because it was natural to me.
Yeah, great. So I want to encourage the audience to please keep the questions coming. That we've had really wonderful questions. But I have a question about MSutas degenerative myopia, and this kind of this theme that shows up in a lot of oral traditions, but also in literature, about somebody seeing more clearly as they lose their sight. And so I was wondering if you could talk more about her degenerative myopia and the ways that you worked through that to communicate the ideas of her coming into consciousness and what that looks like as a person without sight. And I'm also going to attach a question to that, not to make it too complicated, but you also work a lot with the idea of the concept of beauty and the ways that women leverage beauty and weaponize it, and the ways that it's, ultimately can also be very detrimental, and how that's all wrapped up in MSutas' story.
Yeah, absolutely. It's all wrapped up together, the myopia and the idea of beauty. So if you go back to the 1930s, MSuta has two weapons as a girl. She's ridiculously beautiful and light-skinned as well, but she's also very clever. And because she's clever, by the time she's 5 years old, she's realized that there's something about how she looks like. And she learns how to present it, to the world to get whatever she wanted to get, okay? And she gets away with so much, because everybody comments about it. And when you meet her at that time, she's this proud peacock, and she is not developing in other ways that are useful, because her best friend, Alexa, who is not so beautiful, is watching. But also she's learning different ways of surviving in a world that worships beauty when she doesn't have it, okay? So MSuta imagines two things: that men will always want her, okay? But also at the same time, she can have both education and marriage. Now, that was almost impossible at the time. A woman could not ask for that. But she said, I have the beauty. I can have both. So it's until she starts to lose her sight and she cannot see herself. And she imagines that if she's lost her sight, then she has lost her beauty. Then she has lost her ability to marry. That then, after that initial stage of turmoil and pain, she starts to see. Because now that sense is cut off. She's no longer seeing around her. So she looks inside. And when you look inside, you remember. And it's from that memories that she starts to understand the world. That probably she starts also to think about the notions that were passed to her by her grandmothers. And that is when MSuta starts to blossom and to become this, fascinating human being, So for me, myopia suggests that she cannot see, but actually MSuta sees better, okay? She sees better than everybody in the village. Indeed, Chirabo believes that MSuta can see, and actually the rest of the society calls her a witch because she seems to see everything. So that idea of sight, having sight and losing sight, but then having better sight then was quite interesting to me.
Yeah, very good. So we have a question from the audience. This one is coming from Eleni, and they write, were you thinking at all about writing for a young adult audience? Your reading today made me realize that the novel could be read in that way.
I had not for this novel, but when I'm writing all my books, I'm thinking of who I was when I was 15 years old. I always think when I write, would I understand this when I was 15 years old? So I always imagine girls who are about to do their O-levels in Uganda reading the book. But because it's written in a very Ugandan friendly way, I know that girls of 12 years would read it in Uganda because to them, this is so familiar. I took Chintu back to Uganda in 2014 after I'd been told that it's unreadable by publishers out here. And my 14-year-old niece picked it up, and she disappeared for 2 days in her bedroom. And I remember my sister saying, "What is she reading, Jennifer? What is she reading? Why is she hiding away?" And I said, "Well, read it yourself." But I remember her finishing the book and bringing it back to me because she was reading my copy. And she said, "When are you writing the next one?" And that was the best that she could say in terms of, this was fantastic. Where you would say, "Oh, this is wonderful, this is fantastic." My niece said, "When is the next one?" And when a 14-year-old child told me that, I said, forget the British, forget the Americans. If they don't understand, that is their problem. A 14-year-old Ugandan has understood this. So much as I don't think of audience in terms of young adults or adults, for me, as long as a 15-year-old African child can read this book, anyone else can.
Great, thank you. So I had a question about, I was hoping that I would have it better formulated by this time, but I still don't. So I'm gonna just say a few things and hopefully it'll resonate somehow. Because the question I'm asking about is about space and land and the rural versus the urban and those themes that show up and the ways that you're thinking about the commodification of land as this particularly masculine project. And I'm just wondering if you can talk about the ways that you were trying to write about space and trying to write about land versus the sea, and what space is doing for you in this novel. And one of the most, I think, evocative moments for me was when Kirabo was in the car with her father going into Kampala for the first time, and the different changes that she's noticing as the taxi gets farther and farther away from the rural village, from her grandparents' home. And that always stuck out to me. And I was just wondering what you are doing, what is your relationship that you're trying to communicate between the rural and the urban and land and sea and space in general here?
So when it comes to urban and rural, it was very important for me to talk to Ugandans about our beliefs in terms of urban spaces and rural spaces. So this is because of the way the city was set up. So the city Kampala was not built by Africans. Kampala was built by the colonizers. It was their space. So by the time I was a child, there was always still the belief that you can't go to particular roads or spaces as an African because those were white people's spaces. But by the time I was born, Uganda was independent. And yet I could hear those echoes either in songs or in poetry where people were saying, no, we don't go to those spaces. We are frightened of those spaces. They are either white spaces or they're Asian spaces, okay? And so in a way, the city is in such a way that all of us in Uganda are migrants into the city, okay? So indeed, if you go back to Uganda around Christmas time, everybody leaves the cities and goes back where they come from. Because even though people have built around the city, still culturally the city doesn't belong to us. We belong to where our ancestors came from. So by Chilabo crossing from the rural into the city, she's going into a space that is coveted, okay, by the rural. This is where the rich are. This is where electricity is. This is where cars are. This is, and in the rural, you have farms, you have cows, you have, working too hard in the gardens. And indeed, when Chirabo arrives in the city, dad wakes up in the morning, wears a tie, and a car collects him. There's electricity, there's a maid. And she thinks about the life back in the village, and she's like, no, I'll have this. It's until Tom is taken away and grandfather from the rural, who has no electricity, who has no car, must rescue the family. And she realizes that grandfather's wealth, which is rural wealth, is far more reliable traditionally than Western wealth that she has adapted to in the city. And I wanted to have this conversation with Ugandans. The idea that if you have a car, if you're dressed in a particular way, if you are wealthy, and it's the same thing with Africa, the West, So people in Uganda imagine I'm rich because I'm in Britain. But I go back home, I live in a tiny flat like this, I go back home and all my young sisters and brothers, they have their own houses on their own land. They are ridiculously rich, but they are looking at me like I'm wealthier. So it's those spaces, the rural and urban. But when you move it further away, Europe and Africa. So Africa is poor, Europe is wealthy. It's until you come to Europe and you realize, hang on a minute, it's not that. So I wanted to have that conversation with the reader in terms of rural spaces and urban spaces. Of course, it's not transferable when you think of Britain or America in terms of rural and urban spaces.
Great. So I think you've talked a lot about the fact that you're writing and having conversations with Ugandans, and the ways your niece reading the book and how that was like the highest compliment. So I'm wondering if you can take this time to talk about that practice of writing for Ugandans in particular, and also about how you take stories that have been told orally, and what happens to those stories when you incorporate them into the written form, and just the process of you writing for an audience that you know intimately, but also having the book, knowing that people from other places are also going to engage with the novels that you write as well.
Okay, first of all, this is I'm going to have a talk about this specific subject tomorrow with Connecticut University. So I'm a little bit, I'm not sure what to discuss now, when I'm going to discuss it all tomorrow. But for me, I'd always imagined that all writers write to their audiences, to their societies, and therefore the rest of us just have to work our way around text. Because you know what? When I grew up in Uganda, I grew up on Western novels, and they were not British or American writers. Don't worry whether the Africans understand them, and they don't explain stuff to us. But we work our way through it, and we enjoy it. So when I started writing, I thought I would do the same as everybody else in the West does. Of course, that presented me with specific problems, but I think the world is moving on now, and by the world I mean the West. The West is slowly coming to realize that for a long time, we've been writing in a particular way that they understand, that actually we can turn around and write in a different way, and they can start to learn how to work through a text the way we've been doing all our lives, So it became a political thing, but it shouldn't, because for me, writing to a Ugandan audience is like writing with my right hand and then being told to write with my left hand. That was natural to me. And of course, once I realized what was going on, the texts changed. What I wrote, how I wrote, the tone, the attitude, mood, everything changed because I was focused on a particular audience. But then I met a particular reader out here in Britain who was excited about it, who said, oh, we didn't realize that things are being made simple for us, because it's actually patronizing to Western readers, as if, they while I can understand Shakespeare, well, I'm in Uganda at the equator, they won't understand a book like mine, which is pretty simple, So Western readers of a certain ilk are starting to realize and saying, hang on a minute, stop patronizing us. We would like to work our way through your culture, through your text, through your language, the way you do our text. But as I said, I'm going to handle this subject in depth tomorrow.
Great, thank you. Thank you for giving us a little snippet before the actual talk tomorrow. But in relation to this question of having multiple audiences, I was wondering why in the book you connected stories about women, different myths that supported the oppression of women throughout the world, thinking about witchcraft in the African context in different African societies, and connecting it, especially in the beginning when MSutas and Kirabo are talking, thinking about witchcraft as this kind of global phenomenon, the idea of witchcraft as rooted in women. And so you linked those two, and I was wondering what that process was like for you in thinking about the kind of interconnectedness of women's oppression, but also the distinctiveness of the oppression of women, as you mentioned earlier, that oppression of women is culturally specific, but that there are these elements that do tie women together. And how did you think about writing that particular story?
Here's the thing. So for those of you who read the novel, you know that MSutas is not a witch, but the society calls her a witch. That is because that is how society handles women who refuse to conform. We have those terms, the witch, the bitch, the slum, the slut, and of course the wicked woman. And I have all of them in my book, but the whole concept of a woman being a witch is all about a woman being uncontrolled or uncontrollable, where societal norms fail to reign in a woman, then she's thrown into that space of witch. But also sometimes a witch tends to be a very clever woman. Again, because women are not supposed to be clever, So for me, it was important to play, first of all, with those concepts, the slut, the witch, the wicked widow, the terrible stepmother, because all of those concepts are found in the stories, okay? And you don't realize how much storytelling, especially folk tales, were used to oppress women. So this is what MSutas does with Chilabo, because Chilabo loves her folk tales, But each of them, when you listen to them, then because folktales are not innocent, they're working very hard. Okay, and this is why Nsuta tells her, go find me some stories about terrible stepfathers, ugly stepsons, and I'm thinking about Cinderella in the West, it is always women who are portrayed in those particular kind of spaces of the terrible woman. But also Chiloba is being warned that she's soon going into the stepmother realm. But be careful. Look beyond the obvious. So she meets the stepmother and she's straight out of a folk tale, But it's until she grows much older and looks around at stepmother and realizes it's all not as it seems, So for me, it was important to play around with those issues that traditionally have been used to control women, in order for men to get away with whatever they want to.
Great. So we have a question from the audience, and the person is anonymous, but they want to know if you would be willing to tell us a little bit about the next directions you are going in as a writer after this novel.
So I've just finished a book. Well, I'm about to finish a book that is entirely from folk tales that I grew up on, but because they are migrating from my first language and they're migrating from the oral into the written. So they're moving from Luganda into English, but also from oral into the written. They've changed a great deal. And I was writing this story for my niece, who is right now 10 years old. So I took a book back home and gave it to her mother, and she was like, but Auntie Jennifer, Mom doesn't read. I'm the one who reads in the family, but you don't even write for us. And I said, look, I don't know how to write for children. And I remember her looking at me because, African children cannot say whatever they think about you if it's not nice. So, but it must come out, and it came out through her eyes. I mean, she really looked at me like, you're the dumbest aunt ever. So basically it came back during COVID when I was unwell. I started working on this story, and it has developed in such a way that it's a crossover, but it's such a big departure from my usual novels. I don't know. I haven't shown it to my agent. I don't know whether it works or whether they're going to publish it. That's it. However, in terms of my career, but also that is my career. But in terms of adult writing, I am moving away from this very intense focus on Uganda and my culture and the Ganda. And I'm sort of panning out to look at Africa as a whole, but also Africa as a world, because there's the continent, but there's also American Africa, there's South American Africa, there's Caribbean Africa. So I'm putting all that Africa together to see what I can do with it, So basically it's a Pan-African novel, and it's very, very ambitious. I think it's going to take me a long time to write, But so that's the next space where I'm going. I'm quite excited about it because it's ambitious. I don't know whether I can pull it off, but I was starting to get bored with Uganda.
Wow, that sounds amazing. I really want that book to be written. I really like the idea of thinking about Africa as a world. And it sounds so simple, but I think there's a lot there to think about Africa as a world within itself, but also outside of itself.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a world that I know I will not see, but it's a world that I want to see. And if I won't be able to see it, then I might as well write it.
That's wonderful. And so as you've worked on these different projects and thinking about these future projects, do you think that and the projects are different, but do you think there's some kind of organizing principle or a set of questions or something that animates your writing process or the questions that you're trying to answer for yourself as you write these novels?
Let's say that the first two novels have been intensely informed by oral African traditions. I did study oral African traditions for my first degree, because for us in Uganda, when you did a degree in literature, the first year is just about African literature, but we were told you can't do African literature before doing oral African traditions, and when we studied African traditions, because I had been introduced to them at my grandfather's level, studying them as texts was exciting and unbelievable. And I started to go back to these texts and realize, oh my God, the stories I used to tell as a child are doing something else. Some of them were unbelievable. You could be talking about sex, but you have no idea. So you're telling a story, the grown-ups are getting another idea of it. With you children, you're getting a different idea of it. So that excitement, I tried to bring into the novel because I felt that whatever subject that I handled, I could use oral traditions as scaffolding. That there's nothing that I can handle that I would handle that oral traditions have not discussed before, whether it's migration, So that was the first issue. The other issue was always to try and do writing that brings attention to Africa without Europe, because, and I think this came from that, the way Africa is framed out here, pre-colonial, colonial, post-colonial. And I'm like, no, because you see, when you say all of that, you're framing us within Europe, like we didn't have history before, like we don't exist without Europe, So it was very important for me to just cut Europe and colonization out of my books. Not that I succeeded, because in Chintu, I don't have colonization, but at one time I was invited to Oxford University, and the students over there told me, well, the more you didn't write about it, the more colonization screams in your novels. You cannot win. But that is also something that drives me to say, look, you need to stop describing Africa in colonial terms. So this, when I move into the next phase, because now I'm looking at them as phases. Now, the next phase where I'm going to look at Africa being itself, I'm trying it. Of course, it's impossible to totally cut it out because we are part of the world. And also these diasporas are because of the rest of the world. But it is very important for me to start looking at Africa without being framed by the West, because then our literature tends to look like it's reactionary. It reacts to the West. But so that we can now look at ourselves in all our ugliness, in all our beauty, without saying, oh, but that's because of Europe. I so desperately want to get to a space where we are responsible for our beauty, for our ugliness, for our mistakes, for all of that. And that is another driving force for my literature.
That's wonderful. And so we're coming up on time. So I do want to encourage the audience, if you have any burning questions, please put them in the chat. Otherwise, I'll just be here asking questions all day. But I do also want to note that this recording will be made available on the Council of African Studies webpage, so you can access it afterwards. So as we're heading towards the end, one of the things that I wanted to ask in the beginning that I didn't get a chance to ask you is about the role of motherhood in a girl's body of water, and thinking about motherhood as an institution that goes beyond the biological. And I'm just wondering if you can talk about the ways that you're thinking about motherhood in this novel as it's informed by your understanding of Banca culture, and the ways that, it's more of a collective thing than an individual biological process.
Yes, some of the things that brought respect to a woman traditionally was motherhood, was having a child and someone calls you mother. And then if you're somebody's mother, no one is going to treat you with disrespect because you're a mother. And therefore, women felt that they had attained something by becoming mothers. And therefore, women had failed at becoming women because they had not attained motherhood. And I grew up with all of that around me, but it wasn't until all my grandmothers died that I realized that those mothers, both on my mom and my dad's side, and this was incredible, that some of my grandmothers didn't have children. It was unbelievable. But those who didn't have children had more children than those who had children. It was unbelievable. And it was on their death that it was mentioned that she had no children. And everybody gasps and said, but what about all these children, And so, but also the women that I thought were my real grandmother were not. I never met both my real grandmothers. So it's as an older woman, as a mother, but also who is aware of my friends who have not had children. I had to look back on this and think about motherhood and what seems to be, okay, you must have a child to acquire respect. But actually, a lot of women don't have children, but they're masquerading as mothers, and they are loved and treated like mothers, and I just wanted to look at the complexities of these societies, what you think is and what actually is, okay? So Chirabo grows up looking for this particular mother, even though she has so many mothers around her, okay? But in a way, Chirabo's travel to finding mother was mine in terms of discovering all the mothers of my parents, the mothers to my dad and moms, because up to that point, I had no idea. So I just wanted to show that motherhood is not about getting pregnant and going to the labor ward and having a child. It was so much more. And obviously in rural, but also within families, the way we mother our children. So, for example, among my sisters, there's one sister that we all say, if I die, take my children to her, because we know she is very maternal. And then there's one you say, no, please. She says, oh, can you send your children for holidays? I said, thank you. No, because that's the way society is, but on the other hand, we have this distinct, oh my God, she didn't have children. Oh my God, she has so many children. And I guess it's the falling away of traditional structures as we move into the middle classes and we start having nuclear families and we start locking ourselves into gates. Because in the past, even if you had a nuclear family, if you didn't have a gate and a fence around you, children were being mothered all over the village, So I guess I started to grapple with this as well because I've moved into the middle class and I've got my own child and blah, blah. So it became interesting in that respect.
Yeah, it's really great. So we have another question from the audience. This one comes from Nicholas Ali. And first he says, thank you for the excellent expose, truly fascinating perspective. And he asks, in what way would you say intellectual assimilation, especially through culture and language, shapes how Africans see and interrogate their reality?
Could you ask that again? That is a very PhD student kind of question.
So the question is, in what ways would you say intellectual assimilation, especially through culture and language, shapes how Africans see and interrogate their realities?
I still don't get the question. the very first part of it.
Yeah, so I had a similar question too. So I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, because so it's about how assimilation, as I think, as Africans, gain access to education that is like, European at its core as we move abroad. How do those kinds of assimilation into different cultures shape the ways that Africans start to think about their own realities and examine their own realities vis-a-vis the cultures they've been exposed to?
Okay, I think the reason I was just not accepting the question, the idea that movement away from Africa, therefore stimulates intellectual thought about our cultures. I think that's where my mind was going, that assimilation of Europe allows, so just why I kept on saying, can you repeat that question?
I don't think that was where it was going.
Yeah, I was totally not getting it. But here's the thing. Travel is like reading. And perhaps this is why people always say that, a book takes you on a journey. But in my experience, the moving away from my culture and coming to Britain kind of created a distance between me and that culture, okay? And I was able to see it more clearly out here than I did when I was there. And that could be through nostalgia, through missing things around me, but also through watching Britain as an outsider, okay? Because much as I'm in Britain, I don't belong in Britain the way I belonged in Uganda. And therefore, I'm not blinded to what is going on in Britain. And so I've acquired a certain lens that I look back at what I left behind in such an objective way that I'm able to see the beauty, the ugliness, and all of everything. Because in Britain, already I'm an outsider. I see the ugliness, I see the beauty. I cannot be blinded to all of that. And so I take all of that and then look at my culture. And of course, because all these years that I've been in Britain, I've been in university. So there's that intellectual assessment and analysis and study of my culture that goes on naturally in my mind. Okay. And obviously, because I used to teach literature, this has therefore then been translated in my books. And I often worry that I write probably academically up a certain extent in my novels. But for all cultures, you have to move out of your culture to be able to analyze it in a particular way. And we have a traditional saying that it's only a person who hasn't traveled that imagines that his or her mother is the best cook. Okay, but it's you can't help seeing what is beautiful about Britain, though I will never tell them. But also seeing what is ugly about Uganda, which of course is always what I'm talking about most of the time. And therefore, for people in Uganda who've not traveled, it's through books like mine that take what is so familiar to them and make it unfamiliar, that they start to question and say, I'd never looked at my culture. I'd never looked at that specific aspect from that point of view. And I always get this feedback from my sisters who are readers. They always say, how could you see it like that? But it's really not like that. You know, you grew up here with us. You used to do this. And how could you? And I'm like, no, actually take a step away from what you know and look at it from a very different angle, you know? So is that a simulation of, is that assimilating the West? Is that, I don't know, but I call it life.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Thank you so much. We're at time now. We're actually a little over time. This conversation has been obviously so generative, and the audience asked so many wonderful questions. And we just want to thank you again for taking the time to be with us today. This was such a productive conversation and such a wonderful novel. And I can't wait to see all of the other projects that you have in the works come to fruition. I just want to so there's no more questions in the chat, so we resolved that. So I just want to thank the audience for coming and thank Nora and Kristen for always putting on such a wonderful event, and as well as Steph Newell, who had to go to class, but she has been obviously very involved in the planning and organizing of the African Writers Series. So shout outs to everyone for helping put this event together, and thank you so much to the audience for coming. Bye.
Thank you for having me. Bye.